Thank you, Natalie. Welcome, everybody. Give it another minute or two as people join. I think we're probably good to start. So I'll hand it over to Andrew to kick us off. Thank you all for being here.
Yep, thank you, and welcome to the first of our 2023 State School Fund evaluation project meetings on this lovely Friday afternoon. Session is in session, and I think we're all, eager to get started and move through this project. So I'll just spend a couple minutes talking through the agenda that was included with the calendar invitation for this meeting, and give a quick project update, and then we'll dive in. Jade will provide some more details on the substance preliminary findings from the district interviews we've been conducting, as well as talk you all through the draft of our district survey. Then we'll wrap up with some next steps. Relatively short agenda, so plenty of time for question and answer if they arise, and happy to obviously stay on as long as needed to address anybody's questions. So in terms of updates, as you're all aware, we submitted our interim report on December 15th. We incorporated the feedback from ODE and from committee members into the draft that you saw in November. So that is out in the wild, and hoping obviously to build on that sort of preliminary look at some of the issues that we've been discussing through the course of this project. We've continued to work on incorporating ODE data into our quantitative analysis. We're planning to do some revisions and updates to that analysis as we begin to collect preliminary findings from the district survey, to make sure that everything in this project is aligned and that the findings are making sense given what we're hearing from district staff. Hello.
I am on a Zoom meeting. Can I call you back about an hour? Okay, bye.
And so we're continuing with the quantitative analysis and have completed a number of district level interviews. Our goal was to conduct some preliminary interviews to collect some early information to help guide both the survey development and subsequent district engagement. You'll hear from Jade in just a second on what we heard in those interviews, and then finally have prepared a draft of the district survey again that Jade will talk you through momentarily. And so that's the project status update. Did want to just sort of level set all of us. You've seen this multiple times, but in terms of the language, we are here because of a legislative note allocating some general fund dollars to a study of the state school fund, with a specific focus on how the methods that drive distribution of state school fund dollars might affect BIPOC students in particular, with some additional sort of deep dives on variations in school district level practices for resource allocation at the school level, with an eye towards how that might affect BIPOC students. You've also seen these before, but again, sort of as grounding information to remind everybody, our research questions derived from the budget note are these 4 questions here, and we've tried to, I won't read them again, but tried to infuse our research plan and activities aligned with answering these questions to the greatest degree possible. And with that, I will turn it over to Jade just to describe the district interviews conducted to date, and then sort of talk through the survey draft?
Well, we were so pleasantly surprised. We reached out to 6 distinct districts that were chosen based on the size, their geography across the state, the student demographics, and had a really amazing response rate. People eagerly wanted to participate in this. So we had no problem at all reaching out to folks and getting their participation. I think folks are generally really interested in this subject. While I did get a wide range of different kinds of answers about how districts think about their spending, it was clear at all the districts that they were making very thoughtful decisions about how they were allocating resources to different schools, how that was impacting equity across different student types. So great conversations with folks. And I'm going to be sharing some of those emerging themes. Again, it's a small sample size. And so it's kind of hard right now until we have more data from both the survey and additional interviews to really know what the driving factors are that are causing differences among school allocations. So these are sort of preliminary findings. We did speak to 2. Yep. So these are the interview questions. Oh, yeah. And you can, I won't go through all of them, but they match the research questions that Andrew mentioned earlier. So really like thinking about the relationship between that budgeting process and the resource allocation and outcomes for BIPOC students. So how much are those things informing one another? How frequently are schools using any of the outcome metrics to inform input decisions or spending allocations decisions? Who's making these choices? What staff are being directly involved in the process? You know, how involved is the school board in this process? How involved is the academic side staff? You know, all of those kinds of things. And then thinking about the variety of funds that they have access to and how they think about those in distinct ways. So the state school fund revenue relative to Title I funds or federal funds or the student investment account funds, all of those other kinds of funds, and how they're thinking about managing allocations across the funding. And then, you know, asking about particular formulas that they might be using, and including the weighted formula to think about, you know, how that's being spent in either deliberate or non-deliberate ways to address some of the inequities. And then how clear are they about what exactly the money is going to? So yes, I think the slides will be put somewhere, so you will have access to these. And again, these are, you know, it was an open-ended interview where these were sort of the key themes and topics we wanted to get to, but I also followed the thread of where they were going as well, and, you know, really dug into a lot of different strategies that they were using in terms of thinking about allocating their resources. So next slide. So here are some of the decision drivers that I found through these interviews. One was the size of the district. So the larger districts spoke about having a lot more flexibility to sort of subsidize certain kinds of schools or smaller schools that would be hard, you know, if they were doing it just based on, you know, enrollment at those schools, that there were some more flexibility in the kinds of ways that they could spend the money and use it for thinking about equity. They also had more specialized staff to be able to do some of this. Some of that was in the form of like actual, you know, equity committees or an equity director that would help them think through these things. But it was also in a wider range of just, you know, people having unique skill sets and an ability to do more, you know, internal work. Whereas in smaller districts, it was like some of the people were wearing multiple hats and it just wasn't as available to be doing best practice research or thinking about all these other kinds of ways that we could be thinking about the resource allocation. So that size of district seemed to matter a lot. There was a range of perspectives of the school board. Some, while all seemed to offer some clear goals, some of the goals were less specific. So the school board would say, you know, we want to improve literacy across our district. You know, so that didn't lead to some very specific outcome measures, whereas other school boards seem to have much more, you know, a focus on BIPOC students, improvement by a certain percentage that really like drove the funding decisions for the schools, and never, in a kind of really mandatory way, but sort of like, here's what we expect to see from the district's outcomes, and then that would shape the decision making of the schools. Same with key administrative decision makers. When there was senior leadership that seemed to really prioritize equity in the school district by race and ethnicity, those were more deliberately, thought through in the allocation models. Staffing models was an interesting one. I mean, as you can expect, the teachers and staff salaries make up a great portion of this funding. And so the way that those are allocated matter. And some of the schools had more restrictive relationships with their unions, and had different kinds of requirements on what those staffing models would look like than in some of the other districts. And so the more restrictive that those models were, the more they had less flexibility with what to do with some of the remaining funds in terms of using them to think through equity in those districts. And then the declining enrollments. I mean, what we heard from most of the schools was that their enrollments were declining just across the board. And so that was causing there to be less funding coming their way, and more of that funding was going to go to sort of baseline operating costs and less to specific programs or resources that were going to support equitable outcomes. So that was just generally. We also saw some discussion from schools that border another district where there might be different kinds of resources available. So maybe in the case of a district on the edge of another state, students were going to that other state for schooling, or they were going to a more well-funded district, that had, or a bigger district that had more available resources, extracurriculars, et cetera. And so those smaller districts that were butting up against a bigger district were finding that their enrollments were declining even further, so causing even more problems. So they're already a small district. Now they have even less enrollment, and that money is being funneled to a district that had more flexibility with their funding already. So that was some of the tensions that we saw across the interviews. And I'm happy to pause there if folks want to ask anything about these or. Okay. So on to the survey. So we used these initial interviews to really give us a sense of what these districts were thinking about in their decision-making. And now we are hoping to send out this survey to all 197 of the districts. I think that's new information. We hadn't considered doing it for all the districts, but then it just seemed like, why not collect it if folks are willing to take it and get more data about how schools are allocating their resources. And so that's the current plan, although it's open for discussion if folks feel strongly that we should not do that. And I would, love your all's reaction to this survey. We are planning on doing a pilot of the survey to the 6 districts that I've already spoken with. They were, like I said, very receptive and open to meeting and talking and wanting to even be further involved if they were needed. And so we want to take advantage of their willingness to participate by giving these folks who would be, the equivalent of who would be receiving this district the chance to say, hey, this actually doesn't make that much sense, or this could be worded differently, or you should have asked about this. And so we'll do that after we get sort of buy-in from this group about the nature of the survey. And then once we get some additional feedback from those folks, we will feel confident that this is a survey that, makes sense to the people taking it, and then send it off to the 197 districts. Well, or -6 who've already taken it. Okay. This is just sort of the introduction text that, introduces the survey. And, if folks want to take a closer look at it after, maybe we can set a date by which you might offer some additional perspectives. The one thing I'll note here is that we are asking folks to identify their district just so that we can use that to, we could ask them a lot of questions about their district, which would be helpful to know if indeed some of the early findings indicate that size and other things matter. But we don't want to ask them a bunch of questions that we already know the answer to. So we're trying to respect the kind of confidentiality of the respondents, with also wanting to not overburden them with questions. So we're going to ask them about the districts, and then say that their answers are not going to be identified by district. We're just using that to sort of get the larger one. If folks really don't want to identify their district, we do have a portion of the survey that if someone clicked on that, so prefer not to answer, they would get these characteristics to identify them. So at least we have a sense of the kind of district that it is. Okay. So this first one is kind of just explaining that, the schools have various pools of money that they can pull from. And a lot of those funds are pretty restrictive, but that the state school fund is flexible. And so kind of that's just the level setting of like, here's the lay of the land. And then we start with this question, which is, does your district allocate and track expenditures of state school fund revenue separately from expenditures of other non-state school general fund revenue? And so depending on how they answer this question, they are sent into two different directions. So you can see by the little asterisk here, if they didn't say that, then we're going to change this to say general fund, and then it will be more of a general fund question versus a state school fund question. But then the questions vaguely remain the same. So we're curious about whether they think that the allocation practices or methods or formula affect racial and ethnic disparities in educational outcomes at their within their district or at their schools, and see what they say about that. And then what elements of their allocation rules are responsible for either widening or lessening the racial and ethnic differences in outcomes. So there's a lot of, we're trying to do the careful balance between not wanting to take too much of their time and have all these open-ended questions, but also recognizing that this is a nuanced and complex topic that you aren't going to be able to really get at in just a series of yes, no, and 1 through 5 questions. So leaving room for folks to really expand on what's happening, while also getting enough information if people are really just trying to rush through it. And at least we have some yes or no answers and a few other kind of categorical answers. So our school level educational outcomes incorporated into your district's distribution method. Yes, no, or don't know. And then again, an open-ended question. And then we're curious about the recent changes that folks may have made to sort of embed equity into their formula. So this is asking us about some of the changes that school districts have made in their allocation models, and why they've made those changes. And kind of, the 5 years is somewhat arbitrary, but we kind of felt like that was a large enough window and a little more specific than just saying recently, to kind of gauge what the sort of trend is in the district allocation models and what people are thinking about as they make these changes. And for some of the districts that I spoke with, they were constantly updating their model to better reflect current, outcomes and new programs. And so, I do think that there are some districts who are doing a lot of changing, and then others who I think are more relying on a consistent model that's been the way they've done it for a long time. Okay. And then I think this is the last question. Thinking about actual expenditures per student by school, and whether those numbers are shared with the board and leadership, and the transparency of the expenditures and not just the allocated budgets. And so I think, kind of gauging whether schools are one, keeping track of those, and two, sharing those with the leadership of their districts. Oh, I guess there's, the last one, additional information or thoughts, about how state laws or local policies affect this resource allocation. And it's hard to know whether folks, I think we'll get a mix of folks who won't respond with more and others who will say a lot more. Morgan.
Thanks, Jade. So I apologize. I'm jumping the gun a little bit here because I think you want feedback, and I have to jump off for a little bit at 4 o'clock for a legislative meeting. So, and I'm going to preface what I'm about to say by saying that I have really appreciated and been impressed by the work that you and Andrew and the rest of the ECHO team, and the thoughtfulness and the way you've been approaching the budget note. But in my opinion, I think sending out a survey like this on such a, as you mentioned, such a complicated and nuanced topic, I think will provide information that will not be helpful and potentially, give us a really incomplete and inaccurate picture of what's happening out there. And there's a couple of reasons I think that. One is, we've selected the 20-ish districts where we're really going in depth, and you have a chance to ask and answer follow-up questions and have a conversation and get clarifications. And I think it's really hard in a 6 or 7 question survey to really get an in-depth understanding of the complexities of the budget process in school districts across Oregon. And so I just have some real concerns about how this could potentially provide things out of context. And also it really depends on who's answering the question. Like if you send it to superintendents versus business managers or other folks, you're going to potentially get completely different answers and potentially wrong answers, right? Like some people might not have all the information about what's going on. And so that's why I feel like the way you guys have structured the interviews and selected the districts, that you're really able to gather that information and make an informed analysis and draw accurate conclusions. I feel like something like this is something that really has the potential to create a bank of information that I would question a lot of the accuracy of it without the in-depth follow-up and conversations, just knowing kind of who depends on who answers it. And also, I just think that it's just a little bit off the charge of what we're trying to do. And I really like the plan that you've put together to answer the budget note. And I feel like this just feels like a little bit of one-off or a little bit of a rabbit trail that we're going down that kind of distracts from the core work that you guys need to do. So thank you for letting me share that.
Yeah. And let me tell you one additional piece of information that might change your mind, although maybe not, is that we are going to continue to do the in-depth interviews with the 20 additional districts that we have identified. So we'll have that rich pool of data from those districts in addition to the 6 that we already have done. And so I don't know if that changes anything. And then secondly, we would want only the business managers, chief financial officer, the person, like the ones who I've been speaking with, to be able to answer these questions. Because I agree, I think they are uniquely qualified to be able to answer this in ways that maybe even a superintendent wouldn't have the same.
Well, 2 quick thoughts. Thank you for sharing that. It doesn't change my mind for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that this kind of information, really the business managers and the superintendents, generally have that information. And I think the other thing is, so we have 197 districts. So you send this out to all 197 and maybe even the 19 ESDs, because they get state school fund dollars and make budgeting decisions as well. So you've got a survey pool of 200 plus, and, let's say you're fortunate enough to get half of the districts to respond. I think, again, that's where I worry about drawing conclusions. Like, let's say half the districts respond, and you could say, well, we had 50% of the districts in Oregon responded, and 80% of them said yes to this question or no to that question. That is, I think, again, an incomplete picture, because, for example, the 50 largest districts have, 85, 90% of the kids in the state. The other 150 districts have 10 or 12% of the kids in the state. So drawing conclusions at the macro level without putting some of those sort of context and control factors in, I think just, again, could lead to a real misleading picture. But I I appreciate the intent. I just feel like it's off track of what we're trying to accomplish with the budget. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Jackie?
Yes, thank you. I agree with Morgan and, but if the decision would be that we are really looking at sending something out, I really think that, a webinar or something, would be needed to be able to explain this, because as somebody that's been in the field in finance for a number of years, when I read these questions, I actually had to stop and think, like, what are they really asking? And I think you're going to have to provide some additional details. Like in question 1, it talks about, does your district allocate and track expenditures for state school fund revenue separately from expenditures? Well, they're going to say, yes, I track my revenue separate from expenditures because they're different codes of other non-SSF and then general fund revenue. So what exactly, I think we would want to talk through what data points you are looking at there, because to me, I can answer that in about 3 different ways, which would get to that. What are you looking for? And is there a better way to try to collect that information? If I'm thinking of just general fund, non-school fund, non-state school fund, are you talking about state school fund payments that I get from the state, or are you talking about the entire state school fund, all the data points that go into calculating that? Local property taxes, state timber, federal forest fees. There's a whole lot of different things in there. And to me, this question would be like, well, that's a crapshoot. We can throw that one out the window because all of us could answer it in a little bit different way. So I think that there would need to be some additional detail, and I'd be happy to talk through each one of the questions if you decided to do this, so that we can really talk about what is the answer you're going for. And there might be needing to provide some examples of what those include.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, all these points are spot on, and the kind of feedback we're hoping to get, and certainly do want to continue this conversation before we let anything out into the wild beyond sort of the pilot districts. I think, but Jackie, those comments are exactly what we're hoping for. And I think if we do, continue to decide to proceed with this survey, we are interested in having as much conversation with you or others as it takes to make sure that the questions that we're asking people are going to make sense to them. And hadn't thought about providing a webinar, but that's, something we can think about whether we can do that. And if we could not do that, if it still makes sense to proceed with the survey. But thank you both to Morgan and you, Jackie.
And I'm sorry to say I have to jump off this meeting too. So if there's something that you would like me to follow up on or do after this meeting, please let me know. I'm happy to be part of that.
Excellent. Thank you. So let us all, I'll sit with people for a couple more minutes, but as people are mulling this over, I think sort of to Morgan's point, again, certainly open to conversation and the suggestion and maybe reality that what we get back from the survey will not be what we're hoping for. And if that's the consensus and we conclude that, we will not proceed with this, but do hope that by sending something out to a broader set of districts, that we'll get perhaps a more complete set of information. And we did take a lot of time and effort to select a representative sample of 25 districts, and I do agree with Morgan that information from those districts alone will be very helpful. But we are hopeful that a survey will provide, I think, a more comprehensive look at some of these issues. So. Any other thoughts, questions, comments on these questions? Okay.
I'll share real quick. Just again, something to consider, and I know that's a lot of work, but I do feel as a superintendent, if you were able to get, and I know these are public documents, board budgets or district school budgets that are put out there, they usually do get into the education programs, the staffing, the enrollment, the declining enrollment. They get into how you're using funds for curriculum, how you're using funds for title programs, how you're using your ESSER funds. you're getting into so many things about the context of that certain school district and how they use the funding to keep their programs and services, that I do feel that gives folks a pretty decent view of the funding and the allocation of funding and the rationale behind decisions. But I do think that would take a lot of time to review people's budgets and their budget message. And if there was an easier way to do that, I think that kind of conversation, though, with those schools that you've already listed, would likely be, to me at least, a very fruitful conversation on the challenges that they have and how they expend funds to address those challenges. And every school district, I think, has its own challenges based on its context. And that, to me, would at least give you some level of understanding in rural areas or suburban areas or urban areas of what they can do and what they focus on. That's all. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. And also, as always, happy to receive feedback. You'll have access to the slides. The link is posted in the chat and we've made available otherwise. Happy to take feedback, suggestions, offers of conversation after the fact to help us make sure that, again, if we proceed with this, that it's going to be as useful as possible to everybody. So just last slide here, a bit of information is our next steps, and I'll turn it over to Melissa just to walk us through those quickly.
Great. So we'll take what we're hearing here and consider next steps with this survey. What we have thought about is conducting the survey in early February, depending on when it's finalized, and there's a plan with those remaining interviews of the focus districts happening in February and March. And in our previous meeting, these dates for the March and May meetings were tentative, and these are now finalized. So you can mark your calendars, and there will be invitations that go out, but it'll be March 17th and May 12th, and they needed to stay on these Fridays because of the committee schedule in the legislature. So apologies for late Friday afternoon meetings, but I think it's going to be best. And with the on track for the final report delivery in June. So we really appreciate all of your input, and as Andrew and Jade have said, certainly open to other thoughts right now or after this meeting. As you consider what we've talked about here. Great. Well, unless anybody else has further thoughts, we can adjourn, and really appreciate all of your time and participation here. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.